Now, when I go and explain this, Jamaica's history of gang violence is something that is very complex, something that spans over the course of several decades. To understand the current situation, it really is important to understand the historical context and the factors that contributed to the rise of gang violence in it. Because when I say decades, I mean we're talking about going back all the way to the 1960s. In the early years, from the 1960s to the 1970s, Jamaica would gain its independence. This specifically being from Britain in 1962, and the country would then experience a rapid period of modernization and urbanization as more and more people transferred from agriculture to urban work. However, this process also created social and economic disparities, which contributed to the emergence of gangs in these urban areas. In the beginning, before the rise of major drug trafficking, the first gangs in Jamaica were primarily involved in petty crimes, such as theft and extortion, which you would typically see in small, isolated pockets within the urban areas. That, however, was going to change as politics began to be involved. Because what's interesting to note here is that from the 1970s to the 1980s, this is where we would start to see political gangs occur. In the 1970s, Jamaica's two main political parties, the Jamaica Labour Party, the JLP, and the People's National Party, the PNP, began to use gangs as a means of consolidating power and intimidating opponents. These political gangs, known as area leaders or dons, were often armed and violent, and they would play a significant role in the country's electoral violence as different political parties would compete for territory. Really, gangs and politicians were almost one and the same at this point. This problem would get so bad that it would lead to the rise of Shower Posse, a notorious gang from the Kingston neighborhood of Tivoli Gardens, which emerged in the 1980s. This gang was led by Christopher Dudas Coke, who would later become one of Jamaica's most powerful and feared gang leaders. The Shower Posse was involved in a range of different criminal activities, including drug trafficking, extortion, and murder, which with time would gain international connections. As criminal networks began to develop rapidly around the Caribbean, this means that in a central hub like Jamaica, Shower Posse and others were able to gain access to Colombian cartels and West Coast street gangs. These connections enabled Jamaican gangs to expand their operations and engage in even more sophisticated forms of crime, such as drug trafficking, but also money laundering. As this money, as this power, as this influence grew within the gangs over the course of this time period, that in turn would lead to mass violence over the course of the 90s and the 2000s. Gang wars would begin to rip parts of the country apart, as different factions would vie for control of territories and resources. These gang wars were often fueled by political rivalries and were characterized by high levels of violence, including homicides and shootings, in an effort to intimidate either enemy gangs or at the same time, enemy political parties that you were, against? The problem would get so bad that in 2010, the Jamaican government would declare a state of emergency in response to a wave of violence that had swept the country. The state of emergency gave the security forces sweeping powers to detain and search individuals, and it would even lead to the arrest of several high-profile gang leaders, including the one that we mentioned here before, Christopher Dudas Coke. For those of you that are listening to this right now, you need to understand that gang violence, economic troubles, and so much more became so bad in Jamaica that more people in the country of Jamaica wish that they were still a colony of Britain rather than independent. Yes, you heard me right. According to the Gleaner-commissioned Bill Johnson poll of the mid-2010s, 49% of Jamaicans believed that the country would be better off if it had remained a colony of Britain instead of getting independence. Only 27% of Jamaicans disagreed with the statement. Now, it's not necessarily all due to gangs that is happening. There are multiple reasons for this, of course, but nostalgia for the good old days when things were simpler and safer, that is definitely a factor. And as things were getting more dangerous, this feeling would only grow. Because here, my friends, is arguably one of the most important, dangerous, and complicated factors in all the violence that we are discussing here today. Something that is shared amongst many different gangs. That danger is the danger of fragmentation. To explain this, in May of 2010, Jamaica would launch the West Kingston Special Operation, something which would manage to dislodge the country's most established and organized criminal entity, the Shower Posse. This in turn was something that was followed by an intense crackdown targeting varying different gang leaders across the island. Jamaica's murder rate during this time would plummet from 62 per 100,000 in 2009 to actually only 36, which yes, that's still really high, but 36 per 100,000 in 2014. It was a huge drop, which is great, right? Well, yes, sort of, initially, but the problem is the crackdown was not sustained, and the decline in murder would thus only be temporary. By 2017, Jamaica's homicide rate was rising sharply once again. Why would this be the case, you may wonder? Well, you see, in the aftermath of the crackdown, when so many of the key leaders of different gangs were taken out, this in turn would cause the varying different gangs to splinter into many more smaller gang groups, which in turn would fight over territory. To put that into perspective, the number of gangs in Jamaica would increase from 191 in 2010 to 381 in 2018. With Kingston and St. Andrew experiencing most of the increases. As the number of gangs increased, so too did the murder rate. They would be well armed, able to virtually grow their own currency through varying different cannabis production, and would then use this to purchase new high-powered weapons. From the late 2010s onward, guns would only increase in relevance and presence across the island. This is something that is extremely important and critical for Jamaica's gang problem because the majority of murders in the country are committed with guns. Between 2010 and 2018, 76% of all murders were committed with firearms, and it is estimated that 97% of gang murders are committed with guns. Guns, which, as I'm going to mention here a little bit later, were oftentimes smuggled out of the United States directly into criminal hands. Of course, when I say all of this, it is not necessarily all doom and gloom. The government would manage to report a 14.5% decline in murder rates between January and June of 2024, compared to the same period in 2023, as well as a 56% reduction in the number of active gangs in May of 2024 compared to the start of the year. The situation, technically speaking, did improve. However, Jamaica still to this day faces one of the highest levels of gang fragmentation in the entire region. And as a result of that, and increased levels of violence that would be seen towards the end of the year, would be forced to declare another state of emergency. You see, on August 14th, 2024, 8 people, including a 7-year-old boy, were killed in separate gun attacks, which is something that prompted the government to declare another state of emergency. The government described the incident as organized crime and an act of terror and pledged to work with partners to address the issue. As for what the security measures that were implemented under the state of emergency included, that would be things like curfews. The government imposed curfews in certain areas, restricting the movement of people and limiting the hours during which businesses were able to operate. They would increase surveillance, with varying different security forces increasing their presence in the affected areas and using more technologies such as CCTV cameras and stop and search operations to try and monitor and limit the movement of people. When anyone was found that could possibly be associated with gangs, they were detained, oftentimes without charges. Security forces were given the power to detain individuals without charge for up to 90 days, which raised serious concerns for political opponents about the potential for human rights abuses and seizures of power. With the military getting involved in this entire operation, the state of emergency was initially declared for a period of just 14 days, but it was later extended for an additional 30 days. The government would argue that the extension was necessary to allow security forces to complete their operations and ensure that violence was brought under control, but the impact upon the people, the community, was intense. Many people were detained without charge during this time, and there were multiple reports of human rights abuses, including allegations of torture and ill treatment of detainees. The curfew would in turn restrict the movement of people and have a significant impact on local economies, with many businesses being forced to shut down during this time, and the government, as a result, faced severe criticism both inside and outside of it, from both the people as well as the opposition. In response to the criticism, the government would argue that the state of emergency was necessary to protect citizens and restore law and order. It would also argue that it had taken steps to try and address the root causes of the violence that people were complaining about, which, of course, means poverty, including investing in social programs and providing support to affected communities. So yeah, something was done, but despite such efforts, violence has continued. Gunfire between officers and gangsters would break out throughout Spanish Town in January of 2025, and at least one business was burned to the ground after police shot dead Othniel Thickman Loban, who they described as a top leader of the One Order gang. For context, the One Order Gang is something that has long time been considered an ally of the Jamaica Labor Party. Again, this is one of those things where gangs are associated with politicians, and this particular one is believed to be one of the most powerful gangs on the entire island. Really, politics and gangs are unfortunately intertwined. And when I talk about that, Jamaica is not the only one.